Well, I do have the longest intro ever for this, so we'll be doing that. And let's get started. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Well, welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thanks for joining us to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Scott Burleson, and joining me as always, my co-hosts Jan Vermouth and Jonathan Edwards. But today we have an extra special episode as we welcome two of my good friends and superheroes of Jobs Be Done. And we're going to get into the details. We're going to get into the weeds. I was just as we were getting ready, I shared that, these are the types of things of working on a project together. We don't often have an opportunity to talk about theory and different things. So we're going to do that today. First, we've got the one and only Dr. Lance Bettencourt. Lance is widely published. If you're a practitioner in the space, man, you need to know Lance's name. He's widely published, Sloan, MIT Sloan Review, Harvard Business Review, but the resource I recommend probably more than any other is the Customer-Centered Innovation Map. It's where the job, which he co-wrote with Tony Owik, one of our mentors, and it not only unleashes the job map to the world, but does a brilliant job of just describing jobs, outcomes, etc. But Lance, you can't really put him in a box. He's got extensive experience, all sorts of industries, and now he's found a happy home as a purple frog in academia, as a professor of professional practice at TCU. So Lance, good to. I'm glad we've got this podcast as an excuse for us to catch up.
Always a pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Excellent. And now Eric Eskey. Man, if there was some way to measure the most experienced practitioners, you'd have a hard time finding anyone with more experience than Eric. You can't name an industry he hasn't worked within. He's a pro at every bit of it, every bit of the process. It really makes him hard to even like, what does Eric do? He does this, but he also does this and this and this and this and this. Idea generation, data analysis. I mean, that big brain of his, he does it all. And I'll say this, as we do work on things together, he always has fresh approaches. I mean, just off the cuff. And so I really appreciate that. But more important than all of that, both these guys, they're good friends of mine. And I really, Eric, appreciate you being here. I'm just trying to push forward here too fast. But thanks for hanging out, Eric.
I was so glad to be with all of you.
All right. So today we are going to talk Jobs Be Done Shop from a practitioner perspective. And we're going to talk about challenges that we have converting customer needs into an outcome statement. We're not going to go do a lot of background. You might want to read perhaps the Lance's article I just referred to, or Tony Owik's book, What Customers Want. But just in short, when we say outcome, we're referring to a customer need as defined by Tony Owik. It's a metric a customer uses to define how well a job is done. So, for example, if mowing the lawn, you might have an outcome such as minimize the frequency of grass clumps, minimize the time to mow the lawn. To have this conversation with a customer and to uncover these outcomes, as you can imagine, there are difficulties getting that information out of their head and into some kind of language that everybody can understand. And so that's the challenge that we're going to be talking through today. So we have selected a group of just over a dozen, would say, scenarios. We're not going to get through them all, but we're going to begin with one that I framed up, and I'm going to throw it out there, and then anybody in our panel, including our co-hosts, please jump in and help me to solve this problem. Help me to become a better qualitative interviewer. And I'll call this first one, No Outcomes About the Weather. And this is what I mean. In one particular scenario, imagine you're interviewing farmers, and then you want to understand what are the challenges you have growing crops. Without question, they're going to bring up things about the weather. It's too much rain, there's not enough rain, wind. They're going to bring all these things up about the weather. And you might be tempted to say, well, let's minimize the likelihood of too much rain. But unless you have some technology that can change the weather, or maybe some particularly powerful prayers, then that's probably not what you want to do. However, that is the customer's word. There is a real problem there. So what do we probe beyond that? How do we handle that situation when the farmer is describing this very real situation of too much rain, not enough rain, the weather's not ideal?
So Scott, I want to offer a general thought on this first. I can sort of offer what I would ask and that aspect as well. But as I was thinking about this one and thinking about the general conversation we're going to have, some of the scenarios that we're going to talk about, we'll get into, certainly tied to, you've probably heard the actual outcome, but you've got variations of it. Should I go this way? Should I go that way? How should I word it to best capture, the true outcome here, the true measure of success? There are other scenarios, though, that we've laid out, and I think this is one of those where the issue isn't whether we've heard the outcome or not, and you're laying that out, but whether we've asked enough questions to figure out what the true outcome is. And so as I was thinking through the different scenarios we're going to talk about, and I was thinking, like, what's my logic for X, Y, or Z and the decisions I'm going to make? I was trying to think through, well, what's my best practice there? And one best practice right off the top, and it relates to this scenario, is you have to be willing to ask enough questions, probe enough, and look at something from enough different situations and not just take what you heard and move on, but ask what else and why and how and what's the issue there, enough to be sure that you do hear the outcome so that later on you're still going to have the challenges of creating outcome statements from what you've heard and making sure you've got the right level of detail, et cetera. But if you haven't even heard it, then I don't know what you do with that. And so you've always just got to be willing to ask more. If you ask more and you get detail beyond what you need, at least you've got the detail that you need, and you can go back and figure out, oh, I actually am too detailed. I need to be a higher or a level up from that, or I need to combine these two things together. But if you've never heard that level of detail, then it's a problem. And so this is one of those situations where, as you said, rain is an issue, but rain is not the outcome, let's say, due to sort of control issues, if nothing else. And so when the person says rain, so here's my quick thought on how do I then probe, because then I just need to know more. And the main thing that I would ask is simply, what are the problems caused by too much rain? What are the problems caused by too little rain? And it could be anything from, well, one problem with too little rain is taking out even from the crop standpoint, the farmer certainly might say, well, then that means that I need to do a lot of extra irrigation, which is then very costly, water costs, et cetera. And so, all right, so you want to minimize the amount of irrigation required by you to get the crops to, grow, et cetera. But on the flip side, of course, then there could be issues related to pests, just crop growth and maturity and things like that, and various issues of too little rain and, of course, too much rain as well. And so I just want to take that the next step and ask, what are the problems tied to, again, the too much and the too little, and really go at it both ways, because there's probably many outcomes there that are, again, those are probably also, this is a challenge, right? Those are probably also not in the control, per se, of the farmer. The likelihood of damage due to too little rain is still not in the control. And I guess, again, I want to be cautious on this one, is I think sometimes there's lots of outcomes that we have that aren't directly in the control of at least the farmer, but could be impacted by some solution out there to help the farmer to still achieve success in getting the job done. And I want to get at that level, and a level that could help guide innovation, et cetera. Now, the problem here is the innovators here can't control the rain, but they might be able to control certain molds or crop damage or lack of growth due to too little rain or too much rain. And so I still think that's the right level to be at.
I have a story I could share that might be illustrative. We're going to switch to a different crop, though. The crop in this case is a baseball field. So I attended a minor league baseball game a couple of weeks back, and it was stormy, and in fact, it did rain. And I saw something beautiful that happened. Everyone from the concessionaires to the baseball players to the field workers came out, and they actually dragged a tarp across the field. And what I loved about that is that illustrated a very concrete behavior that was in the control of the people involved. And so you might say they have a very concrete job to be done, which you could say is pulling a tarp over the field, and that's a means to an end of preventing the field from getting wet, so on and so on. if we use that as a bookend, like a behavior is something someone can control. On the other end of the bookend is their aspiration, which could be just any wish or concern that's always in the language of the customer. It could be about anything. I wish it didn't rain. I wish the field didn't get wet. And it's in between those two bookends is really where the desired outcome truly rests. So I think Lance is right on. When we learn to probe, to go beyond the wish, get down a little bit deeper. If they start too deep, like I just want to get the tarp over the field more quickly, probe up. It's in that conversation mix that we'll start to discover the real need statements that balance actionability with their true desire outcome.
That's good. I think one of the things that trips us up as practitioners is this notion of the solution independent statement.
Yeah.
Because they're really, pulling that tarp over was a solution. Irrigating that farmer's field was a solution. So I think these are things it's almost like based on your perspective, whether something is a solution or the thing they really want to accomplish. And I don't see that published, I don't see that little nugget published very often. And I think if I'm sort of wandering into one of our other scenarios here, but I think we have to accept that it can be okay to have somewhat of a solution as long as we're intentional about it. It's like one of the things I like to think of any example, but like learning to play music, you sort of have to know what the rules are, and then you can break them, but you're very intentionally doing it. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think, Eric's talking about the pulling the tarp over the field as well. There's lots of situations, we've all encountered these, where the current situation is not optimal and the customer has, I don't think in this case it's a workaround, but that's just a solution like Eric said. But certainly there's plenty of situations also where we've seen customers have workarounds to avoiding some issue, et cetera. And when you've got the workaround, you're trying to figure out, well, why are you doing that? And what's that trying to accomplish? What is the outcome that's trying to satisfy that isn't satisfied by, this other solution set that you have? But also, I do think there's scenarios where I've written outcomes where the customer would like to avoid having to use that workaround or that process step. And I on the one hand, Scott, to your point, you could say, well, is that an outcome that's timeless, et cetera? And sometimes the answer is perhaps yes, sometimes the answer is no. And I'm trying to get timeless outcomes to the extent possible, but there are times that I know I'm violating that, if you will, but I'm okay violating it because it's going to help the client, where the client is at, and where the state of the market is right now. I even think about something as simple as sorting laundry, right? Sorting laundry into whites and colors. That would again be one of those things you go like, well, that's just a necessary part of the step. Well, the job, it's not, right? It's an action step where we're trying to optimize the clean for the different colors of clothing. We're trying to keep the colors from bleeding into the whites from being damaged. You could say the same thing about different other types of materials, cottons from silks and so on. And I do think that it would be relevant to have an outcome something along the lines of minimize the likelihood that sorting is required, the amount of time that must be spent sorting clothing to make sure that they are optimally cleaned, not damaged, et cetera. And again, that's going to go away. If sorting ever just simply goes away, then that one goes away. I mean, actually, it's still officially relevant, even when you've perfectly satisfied it. So in that sense, it doesn't fully go away. But one could argue that maybe that's just putting something in that ties to today's solution. But if I'm talking to people who are cleaning their clothes and doing laundry, this is perhaps a very relevant problem, concern, et cetera, that I'd like to prioritize and I'd like my client to have in front of them, in addition to the other outcomes that they would have about allergens and things along those lines, because again, it may be the bigger deal than the allergens, and I want them to know that.
It's a great example because sorting clothes for the foreseeable future, at least for my limited imagination, is going to be part of what's done, even though it is a solution. So let me ask you, Lance, if you're looking over a set of outcomes for the job of washing clothes or cleaning clothes, and there's a statement in there, minimize the time to sort the laundry into colors, are you flagging that to pull out, or are you leaving it in there?
Well, I'm flagging it for discussion. I mean, that's probably the key thing right there with a colleague and or with the client. And My interesting thing for me today is right. I'm not as active in collecting outcomes and going through this process as all of you. So it's going to be interesting today what level of detail and examples come up for me versus am I speaking very abstractly. But in terms of best practice, one of the things I would always do with my outcomes with clients is, and honestly, there was stages before that when I'm doing my own outcomes just on my own, and I'm just sort of looking through my notes. I'm trying to gather them together. I'm creating main headings and subheadings always. And the subheadings are variations where I think level 1, outcome 4 is really probably the best I have, but I've got 3 subs under that either might be redundant with it or might be better wording, or maybe there's something about it that I like that's not quite captured in the main one, and how do I adjust these? And so I'm doing that for my own sake so I can revisit them once I've gone through other outcomes. It's so that I can work with a colleague of mine and have discussions around these. I'm putting comments off to the side. And then when I send these things to the client, I'm okay also putting those things before the client. Now, it's to a degree, right? I don't want to put before them 50 different things. I need to be the expert and use my judgment of what's really best based on what I know. But there are situations like that where I could say, look, here we've got this outcome. It's very well written. It's concrete, but realistically, this is in the solution space. Is it something that might be helpful for you to have priorities on this? Because in the end of the day, another best practice, right, is in the end of the day, I am creating outcomes for my client. If you're doing this within your company and the product management groups within your company, that is your client, whatever it is, you're doing this for some objective from an innovation perspective. And I need to make sure that my outcomes are best aligned with that objective, with that client priority, which then goes into what we're going to talk about later as far as, well, are there times where you actually might include solution statements or not? The answer is yes, there are times when that might be the case, depending upon what my client's goals are. And then I need to balance that out with, okay, I can't do this many outcomes. I've got to trim it down. And so there's, of course, other practical considerations as well. But I'm thinking about it from a client perspective. And in this case, I might actually be getting their input on it.
And yeah, so
Scott,
yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Oh, watch this. Watch this. Minimize the likelihood that it rains. That satisfies a lot of the rules of outcome gathering.
Yes, it does.
But Jonathan, I want you to imagine for a second that you are the practitioner and you're discussing that outcome statement with Jan. And Jan, it's true that you run an agricultural company, but guess what? You're not growing crops outside. You're growing crops inside in a vertical farm.
Yeah.
So is that outcome, which is very well stated, how relevant would that be to the innovation context where, Jonathan, you're helping Jan to figure out what he should do next?
Yeah. I think that was a great point also by Lance, because I think it's this influence of what you want to achieve, right? There is, so I just kind of phrase this as a question, but because it's, so, okay, the way I'll always try to frame this is to say, well, in the very beginning, or at least when you're talking to customers, really try to forget the solution, honestly. So write something down that's beyond the scope of your solution. But then again, at some point, let's be honest. I mean, maybe not the solution, but at least the company context or the business context sneaks back in, and it's a good thing that it does. So I think it's not something we should be actively working in all of the phases of the project or in all of the phases of that's, so that, I mean, it's how I would describe it. I think there is, but it's very difficult, at least when you start out. I think it's better to have the general idea of saying, let's avoid solutions at all costs. And then kind of what Scott said, break the rules later on as you kind of feel more comfortable with, okay, here and there, I can break or bend the rules a little bit, something like that. But I completely agree, Eric. It really depends on, like, who am I as a business that wants something out of jobs to be done. You don't do this for the sake of jobs to be done, something like that.
Yeah. Like, I can imagine, Jonathan, you might say to Jan, using Lance's approach, like, okay, maybe it's not minimize the likelihood that it rains, but maybe it is minimize the likelihood of overwatering the crop. Or maybe even minimize the likelihood that a fungus grows, because that could be a consequence of too wet of an environment. I can imagine you facilitating a conversation around that.
Yeah, so this would have been, I'm probably the least experienced in terms of being a practitioner of this, but my immediate feeling is as soon as you start talking about actions, so somehow you are in solution land, and so I always felt that the focus on avoiding solutions that's very prevalent in jobs to be done, it might be sometimes also a bit of a hindrance in the way we think. And so in this particular, and I would also point out that I think when you think about it, there are many there are many questions such as the one we are looking at today where where it's actually impossible for the person doing the action to have a real control on it, and so you're gonna be using a solution. Yeah, for sure.
So I want to sort of pull this one to a close so we can move to another one. This has been really good, but just to bring it together, just summarize what I think I'm hearing from everybody. Lance emphasized the importance of just really embracing the divergent phase. Let's make sure we get all the information we can. This thing's happening, it's out of their control. What problems does that cause? And just exploring, and it's probably not one thing. It's like fully explore every possible thing that we solved. Or every problem that it creates, and then that Eric's great about always reframing is like, wait, what is it you really want to accomplish? Eric will use these words. What is your dream? But what is it you're really trying to do? No matter, seems like no matter where we are on the detail, that's always relevant. Okay, whether but what is it you're really trying to do? Just always sort of elevate it up. So we're talking about moving this thing or gathering information both ways. Down, more detail. I don't know if it's literally down, just sort of how I visualize it. Down, more details, more root causes, more problems created, and then going upwards. All right, if you could control the weather, what would that do for you? Like, what is it you're trying to do? Yield or whatever. So I want to move on to the next one, but that was fantastic. Any final thoughts before we move to the next problem?
Can I sneak something in?
Of course.
Sorry, but I just have to. But I think I want to emphasize what you said, Lance. So I found so this is something I think if you haven't done it in practice, it's hard to see the value, or I struggle to explain it. But having discussions with the client about these statements is extremely fruitful. So what we sometimes like to do is just say, okay, here's a list of 60, 80, 100, whatever then it is that you have. And we ask each of the client's members to go through and just say, well, rate them by A, B, C. And you can introduce whatever kind of scale, and A would be I really want to know the kind of the priority of that one, or C is garbage, and then you have a discussion just about that. So you don't have any data on it, but at least suddenly you see patterns where everybody agrees, everybody disagrees, and just the discussion about this is extremely fruitful as well. You suddenly see problems that you otherwise wouldn't have uncovered. So I just want to emphasize that. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's an important point. And is it useful to the client? By the way, it's when you create a list of these and you feel like you're the student and you're bringing your homework to the teacher. In other words, presenting it to the client. My experience is that you're looking for this feedback of detail, and often if you just send it, you probably don't get what you're looking for. So if you can create some kind of interactive way for them to interact with it, sort of force them to evaluate it bit by bit by bit. Eric's brilliant at that, by the way, just asking open-ended questions. But anyway, just really take them through the document. Would this be useful to you? If these are prioritized, what would not be useful to you? You have to sort of encourage them, let's say, to interact with the statement, to uncover whether it'll be useful or not. Because if you were to get this list and have them prioritized, and then they get the list together and they're like, I don't know what to do with this, something's gone wrong. Something's gone wrong along the way. All right, great point. Now, Jan, I want to go. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry, Scott. I feel like I have to say this.
No,
some concrete tips. Never do this alone. Do it with a partner.
Amen.
Read it aloud.
Yes.
Because speaking it is different than reading it.
Yes.
But then really, to Jan's point, you have to engage with it. Yeah. Your experience of an outcome statement, when you actually have to rate it yourself, for importance
yeah.
or satisfaction or something else is totally different than reading it. The more you engage with it, the more you'll figure out if the statement's useful or not.
100%. So I'm gonna reiterate two things you said. One is it's so much better to do a project with a partner where you can, if you can even gather needs separately, compare, I mean, and what's common, what's different. Just like if you were writing a paper together, about editing, you can't really see your own errors. Like Jan's describing, you can't see things that might not make sense to the client because you don't have their domain expertise or whatever. But yeah, you're going to get a better result doing a project with a partner 100% of the time. So you can even just to articulate it, even just to have this conversation. It's sort of hard to have that conversation with yourself. And as I pointed out, you can't really count on the client to necessarily evaluate them as critically as you'd like. But then Eric, also, this is something Eric and I did like just this a week ago. Is like we took a list of needs and we had a client to evaluate them for importance and satisfaction. So we forced them to evaluate them in this scenario in a survey, and then afterwards we met with them and they had at least had to have read them, and they gave us feedback even before we got together, and we ended up with a better result, I think. Yeah. So that's all important, man. It is really hard. You're not going to get as good a result by yourself. Ever, I don't believe, is with a partner. All right, Jan, I want to go to your optimum situation. If you could walk us through that, and then we'll have our panel here to help us out.
Yeah, so I hope optimize. I wasn't 100%, but I think it's a plural of optimum. Like, so that was so the example is this one. Imagine, it's about thermal power plants. So it was a project about it was about planning, operating, and then maintaining as well, like the power plant. And the focus really here is, or the statement that came to mind, it was about the maintenance people that were involved. And so no matter, like, they repeatedly told us that what was important to them is hitting the right moment to replace a spare part. So you have these are huge machines, and maintenance is like critical. It's always ongoing. Like there's always something that isn't perfect and so on. And then sometimes if you have to do maintenance, you actually have to cut down, like you cannot produce power or it takes a long time. So it's really complicated. So, and they talked again and again about this hitting the right moment to replace a spare part. Also because some of the times these spare parts are super expensive. So you kind of want to extend, like you want to go as far as you can in terms of lifetime of a spare part, but not too far, because if it breaks down without you kind of anticipating it, then it's really costly, and then there's a lot of maintenance and possible damage and blah, blah. So it repeatedly came up, this hitting the right moment. And I struggle a lot with these with capturing these optimum moments. Maybe if I'm describing it correctly, that's just one case. So one way of dealing with that would be you split it into two outcomes. So one is kind of capturing it before it breaks down, and the other is more about like not overgoing it or something like that. So you could take the two sides of the optimum, something like that. But I felt like that wouldn't hit. That's not what they said. And just talking about one side. So for example, preventing replacing a spare part too early wouldn't be so important to them as hitting it at the right. So it doesn't really fit what they said. I think I cheated a little bit. I don't know if I cheated a little bit, but the way I phrased it, I'm not 100% following ODI in this case, but I ended on something like that: as often as possible, a spare part is replaced at the right moment. And then I gave an example and said, for example, which means not too late or not too soon. Or you could phrase it something like minimize the likelihood of replacing a spare part at the wrong moment, not too early, not too soon. But it feels like cheating. So, and I bring this up because it also then in the prioritizing in the quant part, this came up as super relevant. But it felt like I kind of avoided the problem with the example part, because if you take it away, it changes the whole meaning of or it could change the whole meaning of the outcome. So it's critical. And I feel like that shouldn't be the case. Like this little part of not too late or not too soon carries too much weight almost in if that makes sense. So yeah, maybe I'm overcomplicating something, but I struggle to capture these optimal optimal moments. So, and I would really love to hear your perspective on that one.
I want Eric to lead.
Oh no!
I was also thinking I don't want the first shot at this.
I've definitely given some thought. I've definitely given some thought to this. I will weigh in, but I really would like to hear Eric's perspective.
Jan, you're calling out to the engineer in me, right? Engineers always want to optimize.
Right.
What you wrote down is absolutely true. And my first instinct is to say, I wonder if that's actually a solution. In other words, if you could do that at the optimal moment, that's really a means to an end to what? If it's too soon, what problems does that cause? And if it's too late, what problems does that cause? And we can just brainstorm very quickly several need statements that are before and after. And so in the spirit of what Lance had shared before, I can imagine you'd have that statement as a heading or a main bullet. You'd have sub-bullets to say the problems that happen in the too early and the too late situation. But now here's the real kicker. Taking one statement that captures very succinctly this idea that I just want to replace the parts at the right time, the optimal time, is concise, it's direct, and it gets the concept conveyed to the customer from who we want the insights very elegantly. Or do we replace that with 6 or 7 related statements that now take room in the survey and maybe prevent us from testing other areas that might be more or less valuable? This is the real debate I think we have to wrestle with.
That's very nice. Yeah.
I knew we should hear from Eric first, so very good. So one of the things that I think of when Eric was talking as well is that as someone new to capturing outcomes, and I've done enough training on this to know that this is a pattern, is people are more likely to put in increase type outcomes. Increase the ability to, which isn't even a metric, but increase the ability to is very common, and or increase the likelihood of, or what have you. And I've used some of those statements as well. So I'm not going to say there's a blanket rule to say you don't use increase. I think there's times where it actually makes more sense. But more often than not, when someone's putting increase in, they are in still the solution space, and they don't realize it because it looks like an outcome. It's got increase, it's got direction, it's got measurement, likelihood, and it's got some object of control there. But more often than not, they're in the outcome space and they don't realize it because it looks like a pretty outcome statement. And that's not what we're talking about here. But when Eric started saying, oh, this optimum could actually be a solution, because it's right, I want to increase the likelihood of replacing at the optimum moment. Well, that then is potentially a solution. So I love what Eric was saying there about that. And then again, back to our earlier discussion of saying, well, then you've got to probe further about, what's right or wrong on both sides, going too early, too late. That said, Eric's other key takeaway, which I just want to reiterate. See, Scott, I'm just doing your part now. I'm just summarizing toward the end because Eric had good comments. We'll just do that. Is Eric just said, look, in the end of the day, there's a very pragmatic concern here as well about survey length. And yes, that might be cheating on the one hand, or it feels like cheating to do the EGs there and to clarify, et cetera. But did the customer understand it? Did the client understand it? Did you get the essence of what we're talking about there? I think it's useful to struggle with this one. I think it's useful to struggle with whether is one outcome that really captures it better than the wording you've got. That's always a good struggle to have. But in the end of the day, I love Eric's perspective of saying, but pragmatically, is getting 6 more detailed statements that are really following the rules of ODI and outcomes here. Is that really a better solution for capturing outcomes for the innovation goal on the client's behalf? And I think sometimes we can be so focused on the rules of outcomes that we pragmatically make it more difficult and we undermine the objectives of the project. And so I love that perspective. Because in the end of the day, there are just practical, pragmatic concerns, whether it be survey length, like Eric was mentioning, but as we talked about earlier, client objectives, et cetera. So all that background, that's just me saying I love what Eric shared, because that was really good. Of all the scenarios that were shared, this was the hardest for me to sort of wrap my mind
That
around.
makes me so
And
happy. You cannot imagine.
yeah, and I literally sat back. I mean, I've got notes here of like I wrote outcomes of what I thought it might be, and I wrote it, and it was like, man, I'm struggling with this, and I wrote another variation, and I wrote it from the opposite direction, and the too early and the too late, and tried to figure out what optimal was, and I just wrote it a bunch of different ways, and again, best practice wise here, I capture the essence, and sometimes when I'm capturing notes from a client, like in the interview, more often than not, I in an interview can just nail the outcome right there, right? The time, they're trying to reduce the time it takes to do something, so it's minimize the time it takes to, and I just nail that little thing there. There's other times where it's like, okay, I'm trying to avoid this problem, and so it's minimize the likelihood of X, Y, Z, and I'm like, okay, what do you mean by that? And I can get that detail. And 2 hours earlier, I'm going to probe up, I'm going to probe down to make sure I'm at the right level, but a lot of times I can nail that. And then there are other times when I'm capturing outcomes where I'm like, there's something there, and I can't get it right now. I don't have it on the fly. And so what I will do is I'll just take notes in my document, which, by the way, I don't know if others know this always. I don't know if you guys have ever covered this best practice or not, but I've always captured my outcomes. This was always what Tony did, and I've always captured best outcomes in an interview real time. And I'm recording as well, but I'm capturing it real time, so I can make sure that I've got the right level of detail. I highlight things so I can go back to it, and so it's guiding me through that conversation. But I can also real time state back statements to the customer I'm interviewing and saying, this is what I'm hearing from you, and these words, does this make sense? But in something like this, I might simply be capturing notes that say, like, there might be 3 sentences of notes here saying, there's an issue here where it's not the right timing. It could be too soon or it could be too late. And the issues with too late or this, and the issues with too soon or this, and da-da-da. I don't know what the outcome is here, but I'd love to get one in the ideal one outcome state. But if I can't, I might just put these outcomes to myself later on. And then later on, I will wrestle with it as I'm doing here. And then I'll talk to my colleague and my collaborator and things along those lines as well, and try to be both pragmatic, but meeting the client goals. I think the bigger question here is 2 things too. Well, I shouldn't say the bigger issue. One question here is, can I violate outcome rules? Is this just cheating? And as we've already talked about, sometimes you need to know the rule and then you need to cheat. I think that there are these situations where there is this too much or too little. And I just glanced at some old outcomes I had this morning, just a quick thing. And as it turned out, I came across one that was in a study of toddler nutrition, and it was, and I had an outcome in there. Again, critique it all you want, better for worse. I had an outcome there that said minimize the likelihood of, I forget exactly how it was worded now, but a likelihood of choosing foods or whatever that have to give my toddler too much or too little of the nutrients that they need for their growth and their development. It was like, well, there it is. Too much, too little. I could have said too much. I could have said too little, but that really wasn't the client's goal or the customer's goal. And so I had both. And so is that a violation of a rule? I don't know. It's trying to be as specific as possible what the client is ultimately trying to control. And so I think that's what needs to be in there. The other one here, though, that Jan has brought up in this example is this idea that I can't think of other examples. So I'm glad that this one's part of our discussion here. I know that there have been other examples I've had in the past where there's something about the context here where it's actually pretty easy to satisfy either end of this. It's actually very easy to satisfy the likelihood of not taking it out too early. I just wait. Yeah. I just wait until it breaks. Right. Exactly, but then that's a problem. That's why I tend to take it out earlier. Yeah. It's also not difficult at all to take it out, to not wait too long. I put it in today. It has a normal life of 1 year. I replace it tomorrow. Boom, done. I didn't wait too long on it. That's easily solved. Yeah. And so in both cases, the outcome can be very easily solved.
Yeah.
But doing the current solution, which is a solution, me taking out too early, too late, waiting, et cetera, creates its own problems. And so I do think that there are scenarios where I think the outcome statement itself needs to have some of that alternative context for it to really resonate. And so I'm just going to state a couple of things here, for better, for worse, some of the things I wrote down, where I was trying to write down the too early, too late part, but I was trying to write it down in a way that captured that other context. And I might still have 2 outcomes here, but I might have it from both, but I would have the context of the other perspective in it. And so a couple of things I wrote down. One was minimize the likelihood that a part is replaced before it is needed because you're trying to keep it from breaking. Okay, so I'm replacing it before it's needed because I'm trying to replace it from breaking. And the alternative, minimize the likelihood a part breaks because you're trying to get maximum value from it and trying not to replace it too soon, if you will. And so we could argue about, too much wording there. The fact that I used you in there and all that is a separate point. But I'm just trying to create that alternative context, because in the end of the day, I want to make sure the client really understands what the challenge is here. It best reflects what the customer is trying to say. And again, then I'm going to go back with my collaborator and go like, is this okay? What do you think? Is this clear? Is this getting what we're trying to get at? Or is it actually that original statement that Jan wrote that's actually the better, the simpler, that ultimately gets to the client goal?
I love that. Was super. I mean, this makes me rethink, not re-question, but rethink how I worded a lot of my statements. But I think there were the two formulations that I brought up were, I think they captured something like the same thing, or at least they kept. That's what was my worry. So if I change the outcome statements, the problem goes away. And that was kind of my worry with not going with either end. But yeah. And Eric, to your point, I can you tell me, like, why did you so quickly think that might be a solution? Like, not because when you mentioned it, I thought, damn, yeah, probably that's a solution.
Honestly, it's probably because Scott taught me that, or Tony taught me that years ago. Whenever someone is in the mode of seeking or searching, and I find this happens in need statements that don't have an extreme point. So when we say, for example, we want to minimize the time it takes to do something, we know as innovators that getting something done in less time is almost always an added value. Minimizing cost almost always necessarily adds value. But making something more accurate or more precise or getting something optimal, it doesn't really fit with the minimized language very well, because there's no 0 point or there's no maximum point. It's somewhere in the middle. So I've always noticed that the framework of a metric and the way that we frame it as an ODI statement struggles when the optimal or the best outcome is actually in the middle somewhere.
What if I could get you guys' response to a statement? This would not follow any outcome rules, but it would follow job rules. What if you had predict when a part should be replaced?
Yeah.
What would be your reaction to that?
I think that gets us into the same space, because definitely prediction, to Eric's point there, something you're trying to do in this case, prediction is definitely in the solution space. And so there I would want to say, what's the benefit of, if you could predict something better, what would be the benefits? What problems would be avoided? Would you be able to get something done faster without hassles, with challenges? What would those challenges be? And so now I want to go into the what's prediction as a solution, like any other solution, and say, how does that help you in some way? Which, total tangent, total side point here, I did a presentation a couple of years ago, and it was actually before all the stuff with ChatGPT came out. It turns out it was very timely before that, but I'd done a presentation on, it was predictive analytics. I think it was leaning toward, it was certainly machine learning, leaning towards artificial intelligence, but I'd also done some stuff, digitalization on this, personalization tied to that, customization, and all these things. And what I ultimately tied every one of them back to is they are all solutions. And again, it's perfect. If you want to guide your AI in any way, or predictive analytics in any way, you still need to get in and understand from the customer's perspective what they're trying to get done, how they measure success, which things are important and not well satisfied today, because that's where, AI is such a versatile tool. It can do so many potential things, but that, like any solution, can also overwhelm clients. And again, it also may not be optimal for any of those areas unless you really intentionally try to optimize it for something where customers are struggling today. And so when you say prediction, that leads me toward artificial intelligence, leads me toward predictive analytics and things like that. And just for everyone, if you're in this space dealing with a client, you need to understand what the benefits of that prediction are, so that you can optimize and focus your predictions, focus your predictive analytics in a way that best helps the customer against their needs.
Yeah. As soon as you say prediction, it's information, right? You're seeking information. Without having that information, to your point, here's all the problems that happen. And presumably with that information, which you could say the information is a solution, but yet I just as a sort of macro observation, I wonder how many of these outcome challenges really boil down to, is this solution that acceptable or not? Because that seems to be thematic with our first couple. Before we go to the third one, I want to ask you a question, Lance, about something you said, something I've wondered about. You said you I forget the statement, but you minimize the likelihood that you could, but you used you in there, and we think of that as a no-no. I can tell you though, in writing statements, I've had times where I felt it was better with it, but usually I try to not have it just because I've been told not to. So, what are your thoughts about including the word "you"? So, minimize the likelihood for you to do something. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
So I appreciate that. So with the statement I gave, honestly, I should take you out. I mean, truthfully, it was simple to me to write it that way. But I would say, even if I'm looking at it right now, minimize the likelihood that part is replaced before it is needed, because the goal is to keep it from breaking, right? That could have been done very well, because you doesn't need to be part of the solution. You're not changing it. It could be changed in some other way, someone else, systems, what have you. That one could be done very well that way. That said, to back into your real bigger question is, are there times where you make sense? I think if you is part of the solution, that's where we have to be cautious. And I'd have to get into specific examples there to think through that. But I think you sometimes is part of the solution. In the example I gave, right, you need to replace it. Well, you're part of the solution of replacing it. Then in that case, I think we can probably avoid it. And if we can avoid it, that's a good thing. But there are situations where it's just weird and awkward not to have you or personal pronouns in there. And so, for example, I've done studies in a nutritional health space. And I could say, right, minimize the likelihood of XYZ to the body. I'm like, it's your body. Yeah. That's what we're talking about here. It's your body. It's not the solution. Your body's not the solution space here. That's the context of the object of control. And I need to say your body because I need you to understand when you're rating this, and I need the client to understand that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about your body or your child or your what have you. And to say the body, which might be some generic rule of never have you, your, me, my, whatever in there, just literally makes it weird and awkward and not practical. And so in those cases, I am very comfortable including you, your pronouns or what have you in there, because it really better achieves the objectives of the project, because it makes things clearer. It makes them easier to read, understand, etc. And so watch out for the you in the solution space. Otherwise, I think there are times where we need to have it in there because it actually better achieves the project objectives.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Any you guys have anything to add to that? That was definitely one of the things I wanted to ask about, but I didn't even have it in our pre stuff, so glad it came up. With that, let's move to yours, Eric. This is the one you titled "Difficulty in Balancing Specificity and Generality." Frame up this challenge for us.
Yes, I might even choose to retitle this to tackle what I think was really the issue I was trying to address. That we write outcome statements almost like a marketer does, in the sense that we're trying to figure out what to say and how to say it for a specific audience. And yet, I think I noticed that I have sometimes struggled to say, well, who's really reading my statements? I know it's the customer rating the survey, the job executors. I know it's my client, but what happens if we get a little bit more specific? So I'm going to recall a study that Lance and I did with Tony a few years ago for a technology company in the context of education. So there's 3 job executors here. There's the teachers, there's clearly the students, but there's also the parents. And this technology company wanted to be the platform that served these 3 different job executor groups. And so we could write down anyone's statement. And even if we acknowledge that these 3 job executors are doing different jobs, there's enough overlap where a single concept can apply to everyone. Like, for example, we want to minimize the likelihood of cheating. The parent, the teacher, and the student potentially have all some relevance or input to that statement. And maybe this is even more relevant because we're in the world of GPTs and artificial intelligence now. So that being said, how do we balance being specific to a teacher who potentially has a master's degree and deep knowledge about getting that technical job done of conveying knowledge to a young mind, with the other end of the spectrum where you have a student who's just learning, their language skills may not be as fully developed, and how do we find the right level of statement that not only solves the three customer groups that are rating it, but then also recognizing that, oh, the marketing team is going to use this opportunity differently than the engineering team or the business team or the executives pitching this to the market. So I'll leave it to the group to help us to navigate. How do we balance general versus specific statements?
So I just made a comment off to the side of this topic as a whole, and I just said this is a key challenge, right? This is definitely a key challenge with doing this. And I think Eric's talking about the language for understanding. I'm going to comment on that aspect as well. But part here, we're dealing with what Eric talked about earlier, right? The area between solution space and dream space, right? And the ultimate higher level goal. And I do think that knowing what your job is, knowing what, and steps in the job potentially, and making sure we're getting outcomes on that job, that does help with part of the problem. Because here the question is always, am I in the dream space? Then I'm probably often outside and exceeding the space of the job that someone's trying to get done, and how they measure success, and where we can control things, where the client could control solutions. And so that aspect of it, and then being in the solution space here being one of the things I love about ODI, and I think that new practitioners may not always fully appreciate, is that solutions aren't just things that you buy. And Eric gave a great example of this earlier of, pulling the tarp over the field, is recognizing that the actions that we take are also solutions, right? Sorting the laundry, pulling the tarp over the field is in solution space as well. And so always being willing to say, what's the purpose of doing that? What's the benefit of doing that? What problems are you trying to avoid? And again, getting at sort of what we know as being these common outcome spaces, avoiding problems and saving time, reducing costs, things that Eric had mentioned earlier, and knowing we need to go and to get into that space. And then being at the right level of detail then for both resonating with the customer in the ratings, that they could understand it, that it would have a chance of popping as an opportunity. And I'm going to come back to that in just a sec. But then also being something that the client could work with, the client could innovate around, that it resonates with the client, things we've talked about earlier. I want to mention this idea that an opportunity could potentially pop as an opportunity if you went to the survey phase. I know we don't always go to survey phase, but when we do, we're going to have these things typically rated in some aspect of importance. There's different ways of doing this, but different aspects of importance, aspects of satisfaction with current solutions that are out there, so we can figure out what an opportunity is. And whether you follow ODI specific ways of doing this or not, best practice in innovation in general is you want to focus on things that are important and not as well satisfied. That's where you find the unmet need. Well, I think this is a tough one, because it's potentially dangerous for a practitioner gathering outcomes to think too much about whether their statements might become opportunities or not in ratings, especially when they're not an expert in that space. And therefore, they're creating things in such a way that might be more likely to pop or not pop. And we don't want to bias the survey. And I'm not talking about I want to write the statement so that it uses high intensity words so it becomes more. I'm not talking about that. I'm still talking about neutrality here, but also recognizing that we are experts in looking at our judgment here, and we do put our judgment in one way or another. And so where is it best applied? Someone could totally challenge me on this. But I do believe that there are times where we need to use our judgment to say, am I getting so detailed into the weeds that there's no way this thing is going to be important across enough of a group out there that it could be an opportunity? And so let me give an example here of one of the things that Eric used as an example here. And Eric was talking about, again, he's talking about this example. So he's not saying this is a great outcome. He's saying, hey, is this too detailed or not? And so he had an example. He said, minimize the likelihood of crop damage due to pests, or minimize the likelihood of crop damage due to nematodes. I don't even know if I'm saying that right because it's not my context. Yeah. But I had commented on the nematodes aspect of saying, look, this is a good example of two potential concerns of going too detailed. One of these is that there's crop damage due to nematodes, and nematodes is what, a type of pest, Eric?
It's a type of worm, and the reason why it's relevant is because to an agrochemical company, the solution they would develop is very different compared to if it's a whitefly or some other pest.
So from a solution standpoint, the client really likes this aspect, but I have concerns about it from two other standpoints of potentially being too specific. And one is, if I'm going to go nematodes, then shouldn't I, well, maybe there's three concerns. Pragmatically, shouldn't I include every other pest type? And suddenly I've got 50 different pest types that are relevant to this crop. And so suddenly survey length and everything else, shouldn't I have all these rated? So pragmatically, Eric mentioned this earlier, that becomes a concern. But the two main concerns that actually I was thinking of is, actually I'm going to go to the second one first in my mind, is does the farmer know? And maybe they do know. Maybe nematodes have a certain type of damage and they can actually see this. If so, then I'm probably okay with it if the farmer would know that that type of damage is nematodes. And I got to say, not just the expert farmer, but the general farmer that's going to be in my survey population, I have to know that, because if the farmer in general doesn't know nematode damage versus other damage, and it's just damage and they know it's due to pests, but they don't know that, then I need to keep it at the level where he said minimize the likelihood of crop damage due to pests. And I might put some EGs on there, maybe, or maybe it's just left at that level, because that's all the farmer can tell me. And I always need to be thinking about that for my surveys, is sometimes too detailed is it has exceeded the level of knowledge of my potential customer in the rating system. Even as I was thinking about another example today, it's like, I want to minimize the time it takes, or actually it's not the way it is. I want to minimize the frequency with which XYZ part on my car needs to be replaced. Okay. Struts. Okay, and we're in the solution space of struts now, but I'm trying to minimize the likelihood that needs to be redone if I'm talking about maintenance on a car. It might be like, what, due to going over potholes, due to just going, due to excess weather conditions, due to whatever. I have no idea. I literally have no idea what the situation is that causes struts to go out sooner or later. And I should never be expected to know that. And the general customer, the general car owner, does not know that. The experts know that. And so if I put all that detail in there, I'm just getting a bunch of junk when I'm at the survey phase. And so that becomes one of my concerns. The other one, though, is from a survey perspective, is nematodes might be, and I think about all crop damage due to pests, it might be this right here. And nematodes might be number one in that list, but it still only goes up this high. The next type of pest is number 2 on the list. It takes you back to this level more. And then number 3 goes up here, and number 4 goes to here. And then there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, all the way up to getting to all pest damage. The farmer absolutely cares about crop damage due to pests. And that could pop, it's important. But when I start breaking that one down into all of its constituent elements, I get like some part of the population cares about nematodes, but it's only 25% of them that say that's really, really important, because they're thinking about this other type of pest, or they're just not even aware. And the next type of farmer is this other type of pest also has this and sees that other type, and they're like 20% say it's really, really very important or extremely important, and so they get that. So in the end of the day, when I'm measuring these things, I get a 3.0 on this importance scale. I get one that's a 2.0 on the importance scale. I get another one that's a 1.5 on the importance scale. None of them will actually pop as opportunities. So the client is looking back at this going, gosh, I guess pests don't matter. Pest damage doesn't matter. But actually, if I have that outcome that says minimize likelihood of crop damage due to pests, 100% of my population cares about that and considers it very important or extremely important at some level. And now I've got a 10.0. So when I'm thinking about this, I am trying to think about, one, the level of knowledge my client has. Secondly, the level of detail that my client needs. I need that as well. But I'm also trying to think about whether I've gone so micro that I'm missing the bigger picture, and I'm literally going to be like, I'm going to miss the opportunity, and my client's going to think there's no opportunity there because I've gone so micro, so specific with what the issue is. And I don't have the answer to this, because I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I think someone could argue, oh, you shouldn't think that way. But I just gave you a scenario, and I've seen scenarios where we missed the opportunity because we went so micro. And so I think it's, if nothing else, a relevant concern that the practitioner should be thinking about and talking about with their collaborator and potentially with their client as well.
Yeah. Can I throw in something and just kind of get your reaction? And I don't know if this is, I don't think it's a solution for the general problem that we're talking about, but in the specific case of what is it, like pests and nematodes, like the thing or the category and then some sub species of it. Well, one way of dealing with it could be that you don't ask that as an outcome at all, but you take it out of kind of the part of the survey that is about outcomes and say, hey, well, here's a list of, I don't know, 10, 15 of the most damaging pests. Tell me which one you're struggling with. And then, so you use that rather as a kind of a profiling aspect, and you leave the general statement in there. So you know, okay, like 100%, probably 100% or 99 point, I don't know what, will say, yes, pest is a problem. And then you would have like an additional data point in order to filter it and say, okay, here's the 20% that said, the only problem I have is nematodes, or do you have, and then, so that could be another kind of workaround in that sense. But I don't think it's a solution to the general problem. I think it's just this specific one could be solved that way.
I actually think I love that idea, and I actually think it could be a solution in some cases to the general problem we're talking about. So I disagree with you that it isn't a general solution. I actually think, no, I think you're onto something there. I think it's really good. No, I like that idea. I like the idea of keeping the general one of minimize likelihood of crop damage due to pests, and then separately having a question that breaks down which type of pests each farmer deals with most, so that you can say, look, it's only 20% that deal with or that have this big concern about nematodes, but that's number one in our list. And so that should still be the one that, so it gives the client the direction, it relies on the proper level of expertise from our farmer, and it gets the, it still focuses in on that main goal that they have. I think that there are times where that higher level statement isn't enough. And so that's the challenge, is it's not always that. But I do think there's plenty of situations, though, where going at the micro detail is way more than we need. And then in that case, Jan, I actually think you've got a great solution, because keep in mind, at the end of the day, ODI is a solution.
Sure.
Yeah. Outcomes are a solution. We are part of the solution set for helping companies to understand what the real needs are in the marketplace for them to innovate. And sometimes why we need to adapt our solution, which includes the survey, the outcome statements, in such a way that best achieves the objectives for our solution. And I actually love what you've just said there, because that's an adaptation that I think could be very important for ultimately making sure the client gets useful data for accomplishing their goals.
You know, you can imagine an adaptive survey where maybe you keep all your statements at a high level, and for the one that an individual rates as high important, low satisfaction, they get this secondary list. Now, I'd say that as a non-data analyst, because I have a feeling that creates some sample size issues, and it creates another set of problems. But it would be it's at least an interesting topic of discussion. If I'm not sure how practical it is all the time, but if you have a couple suspicions, just a few areas, maybe there's a place for it. But that's a great point about just thinking about what's a creative way we could address this, and just sort of break out of the normal way we think of this. Right. We're not going to answer that question quite yet, the one I just posed there at the end of part one. I say part one because we're breaking up this longer episode, or this longer series of challenges that practitioners have when writing outcome statements. You know, something that's very interesting within Job to Be Done is it's a concept that seems so simple, but in practice, there's lots of complexities. And within this episode, we've certainly gotten into a bit of those. And so what's the answer to the question I just posed? How do we deal with those complexities of all the root causes of a long list of contexts? Stay tuned. Listen to our next episode, 70 on the Product Quest podcast, and see how we handle it. We'll see you there.